Hello and welcome to week 2, module 2 in the philosophy of food. Last time we thought about what the metaphysics of food is. We asked questions about what is food, what is the nature of food, what is the essence of food. Now this week we're going to turn to the question of what we can know about food, specifically what we call the epistemology of food. So in this first video, I just want to go through a kind of general overview of what to expect in this module. All right, so when we're thinking about the epistemology of food, the first thing that we should really do is get clear about what we mean regarding this term epistemology. It might be a term that you're not familiar with, so let me start there. The word epistemology this word really just means the study of knowledge. Right, so it's the study of knowledge, but that involves a lot more than just thinking about knowledge. Right? On the one hand, we ask, what is knowledge? Right? We might also ask questions about, how do I know things? Or we might ask questions about the justification of knowledge. Or more specifically, the justification of belief. And of course, there are important questions regarding skepticism. So questions that might lead us to think knowledge is not even possible, that maybe what we take ourselves to know isn't really what we know at all. So this is the general kind of very sort of broad way of thinking about this question of epistemology. Now you might be wondering, how is any of this going to apply to food, specifically the philosophy of food? And that's an important question to consider. So the question I want to raise then is, why should I care? Right? That seems like a natural question to ask, especially since it's not immediately obvious how all this factors into our understanding of food and the philosophy of food. So let me first say that on the one hand, this is a philosophy class, right? This is a kind of an introduction to numerous different philosophical questions and issues that we want to pursue and investigate. And one of the most important issues in any kind of an introductory level philosophy course, a class like this, is this question of what we know. How do we know, right? What is it that we think we know? Do we have justification and reason for believing such things? All of this fits into the basic structure of an introductory level course in philosophy. But that's a pretty pragmatic reason to be concerned with this. I think a more specific reason, and this is the reason that you see in the readings for this week, is because food is risky. Right? Think about all the different things you eat. For instance, I've got here, this is my lunch for today. It's a Nature's Valley protein salted caramel nut bar, granola bar, or whatever. So I eat these quite often because I'm always on the go. I never really look to see what's actually contained, like what are the ingredients in this. I think I usually eat it because it gives me some sort of protein, or at least that's what the label tells me. And you know, it tastes good. So it's easy for me to eat on the go. But how do I know what it says is in it's really what's in it? Why should I trust the labels that I'm reading? Why should I trust the scientists or the companies or even the governments that are responsible for providing the information about what's in this piece of food? So when we think about food, we're literally talking about things that we put into our bodies, things that we're consuming, and that carries quite a bit of risk. Right? I could potentially die or get very ill. When I go to the grocery store, I'm assuming that things like lettuce is going to be safe for me to eat. But we know through experience that that's not always the case. Or when you go out to eat at a restaurant, generally we make this assumption that the people preparing the food for us are not themselves sick. This was certainly a big issue with regard to COVID, right? You're assuming the people preparing the food and the people eating the food around you are healthy. So how do you know any of that? What reasons do we have to believe any of that's true? There's a certain amount of very important risk involved when we put things into our bodies. Right? So it's risky. We have to think about things regarding whether the food is safe. To what extent should we trust the labels? And a third reason, which becomes really, really important, but is probably not something we think about very often, is the fact that the food, generally speaking, oftentimes is produced somewhere very, very far away from where we actually are. Most of the food that we eat is not local, right? Most of the food comes from very far away. Right? So who's to say that it's traveling in the right situation? Who's to say that the environment where the food was originally produced was a safe environment? Especially when you think about food that's coming from different countries, overseas, and to what extent is it being stored properly? So all sorts of different questions that come into place when we think about what it takes for the food to get from the place where it was harvested or where the cattle were raised and so forth, all the way to your dinner table, right? That's a very long sort of process and journey, one that we don't really think about very often. And a fourth reason why thinking about the epistemology of food is particularly important is because food is in some sense private, or at least our knowledge of food is subjective or private. When you take food and you eat it, in a very important sense, you are destroying that food, right? So this is different from things like knowledge of the marker that's in my hand. I don't have private knowledge of the marker in my hand. Other people also can observe and look at and scientifically investigate if they want the marker in my hand. But when we consume food, we destroy it. And so it becomes a part of us in an important sense. And so it's no longer observable for other people. There's this sort of private, introspective, subjective aspect involved in consuming and eating food. Only I can really know what that flavor tastes like, and then once I eat it, it's gone. It's now being digested. So other people can't really observe it and scientifically investigate it, if you will. So that's an additional aspect of the epistemology of food that we should be concerned with. And then finally, there's a fifth point that I think is important to be concerned about. And that fifth point is just simply this distinction between knowledge that versus knowing how. Right? So this distinction is a fairly important distinction in epistemology, generally speaking, where we're trying to understand whether knowledge is simply propositional, right? We know that something is the case, or we have some belief that P, where knowledge is very, very theoretical in an important way, or these other ways of knowing things where it's not some proposition that we know or understand, rather we have a skill that we've developed, right? So you might think about the distinction between knowing that you have to, change the tire by turning the lug nuts, and just having that skill, you have the ability, you know how to change a tire on a car. And this fifth point about the epistemology of food introduces what's sometimes referred to as virtue epistemology, which our author, Plakius, really seems to endorse. This idea of thinking about the way we understanding food in terms of our skills, the different epistemic skills that we can develop, rather than whether or not our beliefs are justified or reliable. So we'll look at that at the end of the module. But there's another point that I think is really important. I'm not putting it up on the board, but I am going to include it at the end of our module. And that's this point about epistemic injustice. All of these different things that we're thinking about with regard to the epistemology of food, I think are very important. We should pay attention to them. I think Plakius does a great job of laying out some of these details. But you might wonder whether or not this is something that is going to be applied to everyone, everywhere, right? There's going to be numerous people that perhaps live in a food desert, or they simply don't have the economic means to be able to research and think about where their food comes from, or the ability to, or the time even, to prepare food in the right sort of way. So there's going to be limitations to what we're going to say here, because not everybody's in a situation where they have the ability or the economic means to do what Plakius seems to be recommending, or what Paulin seems to recommend. And so that's something I think we should pay attention to, because it might give rise to a certain kind of injustice as it relates to what we know about food.